Joining me now in a First on Fox Business interview, Representative Ed Royce from California. He is chairman of the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. Representative, you were the first, even before the FBI came out and said it's North Korea, who said we've got to add harsher sanctions right now. What sanctions do you feel we should take? The president said he will go proportionately once he gets all the information.
No, I think what we need to do is what we did in 2005, Liz, when we found at that time that North Korea was counterfeiting $100 U.S. bills, and that was taken as an open act of hostility against the United States. And so what we did was we put sanctions on the 11 banks in Asia that did business with North Korea, and we told them, you freeze those accounts. And if you don't do so, you will not do any business with the United States. Obviously, all 11 froze the accounts used by North Korea for all of the hard currency inside the regime. They don't have their own banking system. And all of a sudden, the dictator could not pay his generals. Not a good position to be in. The military machinery there, for example, their missile system came to a halt. I think that's exactly what we need to do. We need to do it now. I had legislation I passed into the Senate, my bill to do that, and that is being held up. My hope is that the president will now support it, and now with a Republican Senate, we will send that president to the
So you're
bill to
specifically
his
saying,
desk.
Representative, that we go with sanctions that hurt businesses who do business, but isn't North Korea a rogue nation who, since that first example you talked about, has become more and more isolated, and there aren't that many companies, or correct me if I'm wrong, who are doing business with North Korea, besides countries that we're not getting along with anyway, like Russia and China?
What this has to do with is the financial system utilized by North Korea. And in order to have hard currency, for example, in order to buy gyroscopes for their missiles, in order to be able to pay their generals, they access these 11 banks. Banco Delta Asia was the main one. And when we put these sanctions on the bank itself and indicated to the bank that you will freeze the accounts, what that meant is that half of the currency, half of the GDP of the country is dependent upon this currency that comes in from the outside from their clandestine sales. I mean, they sell all types of things from drugs overseas to missile parts,
okay,
you
so
know,
there's
contraband cigarettes.
There is business, but Representative, and I'm a big free speech person, always have been. I've been trying to explain to people who joke around and say, really, we're going to make such a big deal out of a B comedy that probably wouldn't have done well anyway. This is so much bigger than that. It is so much bigger, but explain to people why we are fighting and whether this is really worth possibly shifting the diplomatic tectonic plates between the United States and a very dangerous country because North Korea is nuclear.
This isn't just the cancellation of this comedy. It's the cancellation so far of 2 movies about North Korea, and there's several scripts that were in process. One of them in particular, a documentary by Mr. Shin, who I interviewed, who had escaped labor camps in North Korea. So if you shut down freedom of expression, freedom of speech in this country about a foreign regime, and you allow that to happen, listen, our government exists to protect Sony and to protect the rights of businesses and right of freedom of expression.
We thought something the president said was right on point, where he said, okay, fine, you shut down this comedy, no big thing, but what about documentaries that may then come forward, which is precisely what you're saying. It seems like you could meet with the president and at least come together on this issue.
Well, except for the fact that when we tried to move against North Korea in the past with bipartisan legislation that we passed out of the House in order to put these types of financial sanctions on North Korea, the president has opposed it. My hope is he reverses his position. And second, I would remind everyone what author Stephen King said back when the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, a fatwa was put on Rushdie, but also on the publishing houses. Stephen King got on the phone with the CEO of one of those companies. He didn't wait for people to call him. He called in, and he said, either you carry Salman Rushdie's books or you take my books off the shelf.
It's brilliant,
right?
but then what about this? Would you bring to Congress, too, a spending bill that would bring government money to protect companies, because the United Kingdom back then spent millions of dollars protecting Salman Rushdie, who was a resident there in the UK at the time. Should we be doing more from a government spending standpoint to protect companies so they can continue their freedoms here in the U.S.?
The legislation that I and the author of Mike Rogers, who chaired the Intel Committee, the legislation we have introduced would instead look at how we change sort of the cybersecurity protections in the United States and put a higher standard in order to better protect infrastructure. I think looking at that is the practical way in which we can get the government involved in setting these higher standards so it's harder in the future. And you've just reported on your network how now there's a discovery that they contracted out at Sony offshore into Asia, the ability to write this code. This malware code, by the way, let me add, the North Korean network have about 3,000 people dedicated to this in their Bureau 121. They have sent those people in the past, some of them up into Moscow to be trained, some of them to Beijing in the past to be trained. They have a certain expertise they've honed by breaking into South Korea's grid and shutting down the parts of the banking system in South Korea.
Yeah.
This is what we have to guard against.
Representative Ed Royce, first on Fox Business, calling for sanctions not just against U.S. companies who do business with, I don't think there are any in North Korea, but any business that does business with North Korea, the U.S. shouldn't even touch. Representative, we appreciate you coming on first on Fox Business for this.
Thank you, Liz.
Please keep us posted. It's a very serious business story and a freedom of speech story. Closing bell ringing.